So one of the bigger questions that I get asked is, what is it like shooting everything on the GR? In other words, being a GR only photographer. So I feel like within that, the first thing that's really being asked is, aren't there functionalities, or are there things that you need from a camera that the GR doesn't offer you, and how do you get around that? So the answer to that is very simple. Not really. So the first restriction that comes from shooting with GR is the amount of lenses that are available. There are 4 focal lengths available if you're using GR only, which is, off the top of my head, 21, 28, 40, and 65 or 70. I always forget exactly what the other extender equals to. Like in my head, I always just think like, portrait telephoto. Yeah, it's the portrait angle. I know it's not necessarily as good or as fast as I would normally want from a portrait telephoto, but generally speaking, those 4 lenses cover all your bases. So typically speaking, within photography, and I say general photography because obviously the GR is not set out for sports and wildlife photography. It doesn't matter what lens you could put on it, like the internals are just not designed for sports and wildlife. I have never done sports and wildlife. Well, that's not entirely true. I did do wildlife one time as a college gig, which is its own story. But for the most part, professionally, I have never been paid to do those types of things. So it doesn't matter to me. Now, so within general photography, you have your ultra wide, your general wide, your medium lens, and your portrait telephoto. So on the ultra wide, you have the 21, which typically speaking, most people prefer a 16 or faster, or excuse me, wider for the ultra wide. 16 is typically the industry standard right now. However, it used to be 21, or excuse me, it used to be 20. So 21, 20, I'm not going to split hairs. I know as you get wider, those, 1 millimeter matters. Like, I understand that as a number, 16 and 20 are not all that far apart, but there is a considerable angle of view difference between a 21 and a 16. There's large difference. However, it is a much older style of work. So what I would miss out there are architectural jobs, like real estate photography. Yeah, you probably wouldn't want to do that exclusively with the original GR3 with the 21 converter on there. But I've gotten some really interesting good shots of wides. Most people who are dealing with landscape photography, I feel like the old 20 is a very interesting field of view for landscape, and I feel like it does very well for landscape. So, I also will say that the 2.8, which ends up being a f4 depth of field, but you're still getting all of the lighting and exposure triangles for a 2.8. It's a very fast lens for a 20. I wouldn't say it's super fast. I understand that there are faster, but when you get into the super fast, whenever you're dealing with landscape, nothing's really moving all that fast. You're also already getting a neutral density filter, an ND filter, built into the camera, so you're not having to, lug one around with you. It's just like I said, it's a much smaller footprint, so that's a much easier, segue for me. The 28 is replacing what's now the 35. I feel like the 28 is one of those other focal lengths that just has kind of gone away out of the nomenclature. I feel like in the 70s and the 80s, 28 ruled over 35 in a lot of ways, and it's just kind of fallen out, except for these really weird handheld, fixed focal length cameras like the 28's come back. And I have to say I much prefer it over a 35. So in that regard, which I feel like a lot of portrait photographers, a lot of like, I just feel like it's such a versatile lens that, a lot of people use 35 for a lot of different things. And I feel like the 28 is just as versatile. It gives you just a little bit more of the background of whatever your subject is. But in terms of subject separation, all those things, it's a masterful lens. So for switching out a 28 to a 35, I feel like if because 35 has become so much more popular, and again, like that's just taste, that's just what people are buying. But I think from an artistic standpoint, the 28 is a perfect size lens for a general wide. Then you get into like the 50 replacement, and I really think that the 50 became the lens, because of the nifty 50s. Like they were very cheaply made 51.8s that were just prevalent everywhere. Like you got them fairly cheap. I want to say, between $100 and $200 for a fairly fast prime. And I think more so than there being a need for a 50 and it's cheap, I think the fact that it's cheap created a need because so many people were shooting with 50 and it was such an entry-level cheap lens that people became comfortable with the 50, and that just kind of became the norm lens. But a 40 is better because, with a 50, you're still, it's not right to the face in terms of, its frame. So typically speaking, unless you're getting really close to someone, what you're typically getting is the chest, like somewhere, around chest to face, that sort of framing. It's like a medium close-up. And I feel like you get that with just a little bit more background with the 40. So the properties of the 40 I actually much prefer because with it being the GR, with it being me typically going to people's places, it's less studio work. You're getting more of the background, you're getting more of the subject because you're putting the subject in their own environment. So getting more of that environment actually helps the shoot in a lot of cases. It's also just a lot more flexible because if you are in a small environment, I can't tell you how many times I've been on a shoot with a 50, and you go to somebody's house, you go to somebody's apartment, and the room that they have to shoot in is small. And you cannot physically back away from them enough to make the 50 usable. So you're like literally they're on one far side of the room, you're on one far side of the room, and you're really struggling to make it work. And I feel like that 40 helps with that. Like, sure, it might, the whole thing I said about there being a little bit more room for background goes out the window. However, you're still able to get the shot that you need, whereas not necessarily possible with a 50. Now, obviously, since I have the 28, if the 50 wouldn't have worked, I would have had this, or if for some reason a 40 wouldn't work, but you get a much different feel on the 40 versus the 28. So I feel like just having that as an option, very helpful. The telephoto, the 70mm-ish lens, is probably the one that I have the bigger problem with of the four. My personal preference for the old telephoto that's also gone out of style, I grew up with older lenses because I grew up poor, and when you're starting out in photography is a fairly expensive hobby when you're starting out and you're just starting to get jobs and you're trying to balance money in versus money out. I like the old 135 2.8. So I've always felt like going from the 135 to the 85 as the normal telephoto portraiture lens is already a problem for me. I also think that part of the problem here is the moving to the zoom lenses, because what you're essentially dealing with is, I used to love the 135 2.8s. Those were the cream of the crop, best telephoto portrait lenses you could buy on the market. The problem is when you started introducing the 70 to 200 2.8, you can get the 2.8 look, quote unquote, on the zoom lens. So the idea of, well, why would I want a dedicated 2.8 135 when I get that focal length and range in a zoom lens? Because it used to be the fastest you could get was about a 3.5. I think that was the best that Nikon made for their zoom. I think it went up to like 210 or something. So introducing it down to a 2.8 really kind of got rid of the... I'm not going to say it got rid of the benefits, but I think it got rid of the benefits in people's minds. So, like, what's the point? Like, on paper, it should be the same. I never thought it was the same. But the idea that you could get something in approximation to that, because the idea of a 135 1.8 at the time, I feel like was a little bit too far out there. Like, nobody was going to make that lens. I've heard of people making that lens now, but the introduction of the 85 1.8, and even later on the 1.4, and I think they even started making 1.2s, because, like once you introduce the 85 as the lens, then it's just an issue of like how fast can we make it. It started replacing that. So for me, the 70 just feels like I wanted a 135. I started accepting 85 like everybody else did. And now I'm going from an 85 to a 70. This feels like I'm going backwards. And it does. And it somewhat is. But here's the biggest difference that I'm feeling. Because this has macro modes, even on the 70. And because there is room, I can get much closer to a subject at 70. And get the same effects that I would have gotten on a larger focal length with the 70. So there is that. 2, the sharpness of the lens itself is noticeably sharper and created specifically for that sensor, to the point where it's seamless and it gets a product from the merging of those two that I've not really seen in a lot of other places. Also, dealing with that macro, I do a lot of product photography. That 70 millimeter with the macro, I can't tell you how much more useful that is as a macro and telephoto lens than like an 85 has ever been. And I've tried those. Typically speaking, what you end up with is what I used to love was the old 55 macros. They don't really make those anymore. I've seen a couple in different whatevers, but like you literally have to go find an old manual focus copy. And now what you're seeing is a lot of like 120, 130, 140, like that general range of telephotos. And they're sharp. They're usually at about a 2.8. But they're garbage for portraiture. I don't know why, and I feel like they've created such a niche thing where like this is for objects, this is for people, and we've kind of created how you separate your subject in the glass and in how we've created these lenses. So the fact that I can do both and do both well with one lens. Because the other problem I have with the 130s is that typically you have to get to a certain closeness to your subject for it to really work well. So the issue becomes if you have a larger object, and sometimes when you're dealing with products, the products are not, the lens manufacturer, what they wanted, what they had in mind is not necessarily the person who's making a product. So now, you're so far away from the product, it's no longer as sharp because it's designed to be sharp at a certain distance from the lens. So I feel like what ends up happening is you need to go back to that 55. And I can't tell you how many times when I was doing, the full frame general route, I would have to go find bring out my old 55 lens, put it on. That's one of the reasons why I never wanted to go mirrorless, is because they never created that lens for mirrorless. And sure, I know you can use the manual focus with an adjuster and all the things. It just, I'm going to make a mirrorless video at some point, and just how useless of a technology this is, and just how gullible and stupid people are for going down that path. I swear to God, this is all Sony marketing, and Sony is the worst. But I feel like the 70 is the perfect hybrid of the 55 that I used to have, and like that 130 macro lens that also is a good amalgamation of the 80 millimeter telephoto portrait lens. Like, you can literally do all three of those jobs with one lens. And when I'm really trying to reduce my footprint, while it isn't the perfect lens for any of those three things, it's so usable for all three at a very professional level, to where you start to appreciate how well thought out the GR system is, that they literally tell you these are the only four lenses that you are ever going to need. There is not, until you start getting into the taking a picture of something that's far away, or taking a picture of something that's moving really fast, there really isn't something out there that you can't do. The only other exception to that is the ultra wide. I just heard now Canon's releasing a 10 millimeter full frame zoom. It goes down to 10 millimeters in full frame. And I'm like, sure, that exists. I have no idea what the barrel distortion is on it, but I would assume it's there. Wides are getting better all the time. So I'm not trying to crap on anybody or say, it must be awful. However, it's something to consider. But it gets too close to the fisheye thing. I also have found recently that a lot of the, they're baking in corrections so much into the sensor and so much into the raw file, that what they're doing is they're basically taking fisheye lenses and correcting them in the sensor, in the raw file data, to make them look like they're not fisheye anymore, like there's no distortion anymore. So essentially, like, you are getting the image in, you're getting all of the distortions into the image, and then with the pixels, you're moving the pixels where the computer thinks they should go. But you're honestly not even getting the information. So, like, I don't understand how you get recovery from that. It's basically an AI image at that point. So I feel like the direction that we're going in terms of actually getting information to the sensor and getting real pixel information to the client, there's just such a fake uncanny valley feel that exists within digital photography to me. The je ne sais quoi of a real photo and of a real, I want to touch that, I want to lick it, I want to interact with that feels real. That very, very few camera manufacturers and lens manufacturers are going for that. So that's my take on that. The next real issue of being a GR-only photographer is the video downsides and pitfalls, which, real quick, I've made a GR video, I feel like there's nothing wrong with the GR video. There are things I would like improved, and if you're making a direct comparison to another camera, sure. You're not getting the manual controls in video that you would like. You're not getting 4K. You're not getting really... the one thing I didn't mention in the video, which I'll bring now, is the IBIS is not made for video. In fact, when you're making video files, I make sure to take my IBIS off, because there's just too much movement and things of that nature. I also want to apologize. I realize my voice is kind of leaving me. I've been sick for 2 weeks, and I'm just trying to knock out a bunch of videos that I've been writing because I can't really speak too much because of issues. So I apologize, all the things. But yeah, IBIS, not really usable. Also, battery life is atrocious, which is just a general complaint of the GR, that you need to have, 2 or 3 batteries in your pocket at all time, no matter what the job is. One of the nice things that I have for these kind of videos that I do is that I can literally plug in with a USB-C cord, and I can just run off of that charge, so that way I'm not eating battery as I'm making videos and things of that nature. I think that the actual look of the image is good. However, because of the low sensor readout, while you're getting a good image fidelity, I think it's not as sharp as it could be. I mean, you are getting a certain amount of sharpness from the lens. Like, there's some lens qualities in there, even though the files are not as sharp as they could be. You're not getting the audio part, which is my biggest concern, because it makes more work for me to try and create an external audio file from an external recorder, which is what it is. But other than that, I think you can do professional work with it if you understand. Here's the thing, you have to be professional enough to make up for the flaws of your equipment and not showcase them. So that's all on you. If you're used to doing, working a certain way with a certain other camera, then you go to this one and you're like, well, this camera doesn't do what my old camera does. Well, I can't help you there. If you've only learned a certain way, then you very limited your skills, and it's a way of thinking and it's a way of working. I don't mind workarounds. I actually find that you're the most creative trying to find workarounds for equipment. I think in movie making in general, CGI has created such a lack of limitations that people do whatever the heck they want, and they never stop to think if they should. It's the whole Jurassic Park problem, which, funny enough, was largely subtextually about CGI. Anywho, this is the opposite of CGI, and I feel like you have to want that gritty, touch-it feel. Whether it be video, whether it be your stills, regardless of the thing, like this, while there are some technical marvel aspects to the GR, it is not in and of itself the most miraculous of things. It is what it is. It cares about 2 things: pocketability and size, image quality. Those are the only 2 things. Everything else takes a backseat to those 2 things. The battery life, the video, all the things it's going to make you do is designed to give you a smaller footprint of equipment. So you either want that or you don't. The last thing I will say, which is a pretty good note, is what other people think when you show up. So most of what I do is studio work. So my clients hire me based upon my portfolio. They like the image output, because again, image output is something the camera excels at. So then they hire me to do similar images because they like my ideas for their product. So, I do that. And then I give them the product, they're happy with the product, and they never see the camera and they never care. Typically speaking, the people who are most likely to see the camera are models. Models don't care at all. Ever. Not ever, but for the most part they don't care. So they're just lucky that, the way they look at it is they're getting paid. So what do they have to do to get paid? And how can they help you with the, making a good image so that they can get hired by somebody else and improve their portfolio? So they don't really care about the camera. Now, the only time that matters, I don't tend to work with large agencies. I tend to work with models who work for themselves. There's a whole reason for that, and I'm not going to get into it right now, but there's just a lot of shady business practices. So some of the models that I've worked with are getting out of contracts with those agencies, and they're starting to work for themselves. Okay, fair enough. So they get hired, and they show up and they see me with my tiny little camera, And here's the thing, like I never expect for a model to understand what I'm shooting with, like, or clients or anyone else. Like as a general rule, as a photographer, when you show up with a camera, just assume that no one knows what the camera is, no one knows what the specs are, no one really knows anything. Like they might be able to tell the difference between a mirrorless and it looks new, or that looks old and that's a DSLR and I know DSLRs are old. What are you trying to do to me? In the event that someone looks at you and they're like, oh, you're using a point and shoot, what are you doing? You typically just explain to them it has a larger sensor than it looks. Did you get a chance to look at my portfolio? And, you know, typically speaking, like the biggest issue that comes from having a smaller camera is that they're worried about getting paid. So, you know, I typically pay models in cash rather than check for that reason, one. But also it's more on the up and up. I do have them, you know, sign off saying that they were paid so that there's a receipt on my end for my, you know, finances. But for the most part, as long as the model is getting paid, they don't really care. They would like to have something for their own portfolio, but like models don't always get that. Like sometimes they show up for jobs and they're not happy with the results. So, you know, they're not going to not take those jobs. They just would probably prefer to take other jobs. But typically once a model has worked with me for a couple of times and they've gotten the results back, they're like, not a problem anymore. So I've never had a model show up, see the camera, and leave. That's never happened in the history of ever to me. The other issue is when you show up for something like, you know, I do like I offer weddings full time. A lot of people don't take me up on it because, again, I think the small camera idea is, you know, it's a weird aesthetic choice. I feel like it lends more into the documentarian type of pictures, and you know it's its own style of, you know, a wedding session. The same is true with portrait sessions and things of that nature. It's also not something that I really advertise for. It's just something that I like to have on my website, that if I'm local or I'm in your area, because I do travel a lot, I like to meet people. You know, I think that when you work primarily with corporations and you're dealing with, you know, bigwigs, sometimes you just, you know, you never leave the house is the problem. Like, you know, I see the people who I am generally around, but you don't really get a chance to meet new people, except for models. And, you know, most of the boutiques I work with are female boutiques, so it's like I never want to get too friendly with models. I'm never trying to like overstep a bound or whatever. So like being able to meet like a local business or a, you know, a portrait session or whatever the case may be, a wedding, you know, it's just a much more social event, and I do offer it more so for that aspect than for, you know, my own artistic reasons or for finances. In fact, because of, you know, the social aspect to those things, I actually decrease prices a little bit lower than I normally would because of that. So anyways, nobody really says anything there anyway because they're hiring you based upon your portfolio. The only, like, the really good example I have is I just did a hotel. So it was a bed and breakfast and they were just opening. They wanted me to do all the photography for the opening, you know, for their advertising. So I show up, and typically speaking, my old bag, just so you're aware, is this huge backpack that's just full of lenses and cameras. It weighs a lot of weight. It has lighting equipment and all the things, right? Now what I have is I have almost nothing. I have like a side pouch bag that looks like what a tourist would have. It has two cameras, the two lens extensions. It has a small tripod. It has a like a gimbal, and it has one exterior flash and you know, a cord to that. A couple of very small batteries and a charger, and a laptop. that's it. That's my entire bag. I do have a couple of boxes and things of that nature for, and backdrops that I use for product stuff in my home studio. But when I'm traveling, I don't typically need those things. I mean, I would bring them if I needed them, obviously, but it's not something that I'm showing up to a gig with. So, typically speaking, when I'm walking into a job like that, I've been traveling for however long it took to get there, whether driving or flying. And mostly I've been worried about losing or breaking my equipment. And I really just want to get to my room or to wherever I'm going and put my equipment down and make sure it's situated so it doesn't get knocked over or broken or stolen. With this, it's so light, I don't notice lugging it around. So I'm just generally in a happier mood to deal with a client. 2, the camera's lighter, and it's not dealing with what lens am I going to be using, like there's not as many choices. So, typically speaking, like the moment I get to the location, or in this case, when I got to the location, I took the camera out and I was just trying to get an idea of how they wanted. So like you're going up to the entrance to the bed and breakfast, which is typically what patrons are going to see anyway, because it's, the entrance to where they're going to be staying. So they want like an indelible image of that. So as I'm walking up, I shoot it from 3 or 4 different ways, and I'm getting like little pickup shots of like some of the little detail from the architecture or, bits and pieces that the owner has put out. So by the time that the owner sees the camera that I'm using and is maybe thinking like, what's going on here? I'm already showing him things that I've already done. I'm showing him the work. I'm showing him the output of the camera, which is ultimately what he's buying and paying for anyway. So the idea of like, I don't like the way your camera looks, but I like the images that it brings out, and I like what you're doing, and you have examples. And I'm able to do that much quicker and faster in terms of setup because, again, IBIS, I don't always need the tripod. Now, I typically use a tripod, especially for that type of work. But, for some of the pickup shots, maybe less so. Having the ND filter, having, just the ease of use. Having the camera be small enough that, like, some of the, like, shots that you would take, the camera's so heavy you're going to get shake in it. So you're like, I actually need a tripod and I need to lock it down to try and attempt that shot. Whereas with this, it's so small, it's so light, and with the IBIS on top of it, even if I have to drop my shutter speed low, I'm very comfortable with a fifth and a second and above. Very comfortable. I can get up to a second with this tack sharp base ISO, which is awesome. So the ability to just pick up shots that, like, typically you're getting paid by the hour, typically. Or at least you're thinking about your ratio of like hour to time and what I'm getting paid, and you don't want to do too much work for too little money and all the things, but you still want to do a good job. And there are certain shots, especially in an environment, that you think to yourself, this is going to take a 30 or 40 minute setup to get correct. And I don't know if I need it. I don't know how it's going to turn out. It is a adventure shot. It might turn good. I think it might work. But here are the shots that I know that I need. So I don't want to risk not getting them for a shot that doesn't even pan out well in order that maybe it does. I feel like with the GR, that shot might take 3 to 5 minutes, which is a much less of a time investment. And maybe that shot's amazing, maybe it's not, maybe it is a throwaway, maybe it's something that you love. I find when I sit down for the end of the day, and I look at what I did, and I look at the compilation of shots, there's so much more material. And it's like, what ends up happening is I end up throwing out a lot of the like, oh, this is the shot I thought I needed, but like, there's so many more amazing ones, it doesn't even matter. And those are the, the base shots that you know that you need are not typically the shots that wow people into hiring you. it's those funky, maybe it'll work shots. And then when they do work and you can actually pull them off and you can put that in your portfolio, then people are like, oh my God. And I feel like I get more of those with this than I did when, I was much more on a schedule. And I understand, I've always said this before, and I will maybe go into more detail about it eventually. But being a professional isn't necessarily about taking the best photos. It's about getting the shots that you need for a client that are good enough, that are going to make them happy on a schedule, and being able to turn that out in a reproducible amount of time and whatever. So it's like, if you're a portrait session photographer, and you get 8 clients in a day, you need to be able to do all 8 clients on schedule and get good enough shots that they're happy at the end. Sure, if you had all day with one client and you could, try a bunch of things and do all the whatever, you might be able to get a better shot than you got all day with 8 clients. But are you going to get all of the shots that the clients wanted in that time while you're chasing, the best shot that you want for your portfolio? The answer is no, you're not. So that's the difference between an amateur who's chasing his own dragon and somebody who's like, look, these are the parameters of what I'm expected to get from clients that I'm trying to sell to. And when you can do those quickly, and you can do the pickup shots on your own quickly enough that it doesn't interfere, and you can still do both, that's when you can kind of go across and do both. And I think that's what makes this camera special, is it not only does it take your footprint of equipment away, but it takes the footprint of time away to where you can just work faster.